I never expected to find myself in this situation. It wasn't something I had planned or even considered. Life sometimes takes unexpected turns, shifting the ground beneath your feet when you least expect it. It began on a seemingly ordinary afternoon, the kind that should have faded into memory without significance. But that day lingered. That day altered everything. The house was quiet, with only the gentle hum of the air conditioner and occasional birdsong filtering through the windows. I had just finished organizing the kitchen when I felt a presence, not fleeting, but deliberate and watchful. When I turned, there he was standing in the doorway. My stepson, Harvey. Harvey had always been courteous and respectful, the kind of young man who held doors open and expressed gratitude without prompting. But lately, something had shifted in the way he regarded me. Initially, I dismissed it as nothing significant. He was 22, navigating that ambiguous territory between youth and adulthood, still trying to establish his place in the world. He had always been close with his father, but since Marcus had been traveling more frequently for work, Harvey had spent increased time around me. I appreciated the company, but this felt different. His gaze wasn't casual, it was focused, intentional, as though he were trying to decipher something, waiting to observe my reaction. I felt an unsettling warmth bloom in my chest, something disconcerting, yet oddly exhilarating. "Do you need something?" I asked, maintaining a steady voice. He hesitated before shaking his head. "No, just thinking." I could have asked what about, but some part of me already knew the answer, and perhaps a part of me wanted to hear it spoken aloud. Instead, I turned back to the sink, focusing on the soapy water spiraling down the drain. Dinner that evening was uneventful, or at least should have been. The television played softly in the background while Harvey and I sat across from each other at the dining table. I inquired about his classes, his summer plans. He answered, but there was an undercurrent in his voice, a subtle edge that wasn't typically present. I sensed it in the way he observed me, as though waiting for something, an opportunity. Later that night, after I had retired upstairs, I heard a knock on my bedroom door. It was late, too late for casual conversation. I hesitated before opening it, my breath catching slightly when I saw him standing there. He appeared to want to speak, but couldn't find the words. He ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know what I'm doing." Neither did I, but I recognized we were standing at the precipice of something, a boundary we shouldn't cross, one that was beginning to blur. "Harvey," I said carefully, "this isn't." "I know," he interrupted, "but that doesn't change anything, does it?" His words hung between us, heavy with implication. I should have stepped back, closed the door, ended whatever was developing before it could begin. But instead, I remained motionless, watching him, waiting. "Good night," he finally said, his voice quieter now, as though he had reached some private conclusion. Then he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, my pulse unsteady. I closed the door, but sleep eluded me that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the look in his eyes, the tension in his voice. It was wrong, it was dangerous, it was something I should never have allowed to develop. And yet, I knew this wasn't finished, not even close. I awoke the next morning feeling as though I had barely slept. The previous night had replayed continuously in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something irreversible had shifted between us. I proceeded with my morning routine as normally as possible, hoping that by pretending nothing had happened, it would simply dissolve into the past. But when I descended the stairs and saw Harvey in the kitchen, I knew I had been mistaken. He was leaning against the counter, coffee mug in hand, watching me with that same intensity one had felt the night before. "Morning," he said casually, as if nothing had changed. "Morning," I echoed, forcing a smile. I kept my movements deliberate as I poured myself coffee, careful not to look at him too long. If I revealed too much, if I allowed him to see the thoughts swirling inside me, I wasn't sure I could retract them. I sat at the table, hoping that maintaining distance might dissipate the tension. But Harvey didn't leave. Instead, he sat across from me, taking slow sips of his coffee. "You didn't sleep much," he finally said. I looked up sharply, my heart skipping. "What makes you say that? I could hear you moving around. You were up late." He was watching me again, that same searching look that tightened my stomach. I forced myself to remain calm, to keep my voice light. Just had trouble settling down, I guess. Nothing unusual. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned forward, setting his mug down. Was it because of me? There it was, the question I had been dreading, the one that would pull me further into this dangerous territory if I wasn't careful. Harvey, I think we need to be careful here, I said, my voice steady despite my clenched hands in my lap. I know things feel different lately, but… They don't just feel different, he interrupted. They are different. I swallowed hard. That doesn't mean we have to act on it. He studied me for a long moment, and briefly I thought perhaps that would end it, that he might nod, acknowledge understanding, and we could return to how things were before. But then he stood slowly, deliberately, and moved around the table toward me. My breath caught as he placed a hand on the back of my chair, his body close enough that I could feel his warmth. You don't really believe that, do you? He murmured. My heart pounded in my chest. I needed to stop this, to stand and create distance between us, but I remained motionless. I couldn't move. He reached out, his fingers barely brushing my arm, and I felt the atmosphere in the room shift. Harvey, I breathed, my voice barely audible. He waited, his eyes locked on mine, waiting for permission, and for one terrifying, exhilarating moment, I wanted to give it. The sound of the front door opening shattered the moment. I jerked back just as Marcus stepped into the house, setting his briefcase down with a sigh. Hey, sweetheart, he called. Sorry I got back so late. Traffic was awful. I rose quickly from my chair, pulse racing. You're home early. He smiled and approached to kiss my cheek, oblivious to the tension that had been building. Meetings wrapped up quicker than expected. Thought I'd surprise you. That's nice, I managed, forcing a smile. Harvey had moved away, his expression unreadable, but I could still feel the weight of what had almost transpired between us. I had told myself it was nothing, that I wouldn't allow this to progress further. But now, standing there with my husband mere feet away, I knew deep down that it wasn't over. Not even close. I spent the remainder of the evening avoiding Harvey. Each time I caught his gaze, I felt as though Marcus would somehow perceive the truth, as if the weight of what had nearly happened was visible on my face. I busied myself in the kitchen, pretending to be absorbed in preparing vegetables, stirring sauces, anything to keep my hands occupied. I could feel Harvey's presence in the room, the way he lingered, his attention never straying far from me. Dinner was a subdued affair. Marcus, oblivious to the tension crackling in the air, was too preoccupied discussing his meetings, the challenges at work, his weekend plans. Harvey barely spoke, answering in brief responses, his fork idly pushing food around his plate. I was no better. My mind racing, my body tense, every nerve aware of his presence just across the table. After dinner, Marcus settled onto the couch, exhausted from his long day, flipping through television channels without much interest. I excused myself to the kitchen, ostensibly to clean up but really to gather my thoughts. The moment I was alone, I exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the counter. I needed space, time, clarity, but I was granted none of these things. I sensed him before I heard him. Harvey's presence was unmistakable, the subtle shift of energy in the room sending a shiver down my spine. I didn't turn, but I knew he stood behind me. We need to talk, he said softly. Not now, I whispered back, my fingers tightening around the dish towel. Then when? His voice was low, persistent, and entirely too close. This can't happen, I said, barely audible. It was a mistake. We need to forget about it. You don't believe that, he countered, stepping closer. I see it in your eyes. I closed my eyes, willing myself to find the strength to push him away, to end whatever this was before it progressed further. But when I opened them and turned to face him, the words caught in my throat. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held something deeper, something dangerous, a challenge. Harvey. A noise from the living room made us both freeze. Marcus laughed at something on television, completely unaware of what was unfolding mere feet away. The spell broke, and I exhaled shakily, stepping back. "Go to bed," I said firmly. "This conversation is over." He hesitated, jaw tightening, but after a long moment he nodded. Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing up the stairs. I leaned against the counter, my pulse hammering. I had ended it. I had drawn a line. But deep down, I knew that line had already started to blur the moment I allowed myself to consider something more. The days that followed were filled with unbearable tension. Harvey was always there, a constant reminder of what had nearly happened. He didn't push, didn't corner me again, but the silence between us was heavy with unspoken words. Marcus left for another business trip that Friday, kissing my cheek before heading out with his suitcase. "Call me if you need anything," he said, smiling warmly. I nodded, forcing a smile. "I will. Be safe." The moment the door closed behind him, I released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. And then I felt it, the weight of someone watching me. I turned, and there he was, standing at the foot of the stairs. Harvey. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence stretched between us, filled with everything neither of us dared to acknowledge aloud. I knew in that moment that I stood at the edge of something I couldn't undo, and I wasn't certain I wanted to stop myself from falling. The house felt different with Marcus gone, quieter, the silence almost thick with anticipation. I knew Harvey remained in the house, but he hadn't spoken since my husband had left that morning. The tension between us had only grown, unspoken yet undeniable, hovering in the air like an invisible force drawing me towards something I knew I shouldn't desire. I occupied myself with mindless tasks, hoping distractions would quiet the thoughts creeping into my mind. I cleaned counters, reorganized the spice rack, even folded laundry that didn't need folding, but nothing could prevent my mind from drifting to him. At noon, I realized I hadn't seen Harvey all morning. Had he left? Was he avoiding me? A mixture of relief and disappointment settled in my chest. I admonished myself for caring at all. I needed space, time to clear my head before I did something irreversible. I made my way to the living room and sank onto the couch, hoping television might provide a suitable distraction. But just as I reached for the remote, I heard footsteps on the stairs. I turned and there he was. Harvey stood at the bottom step, watching me. He looked contemplative, his hands resting on the banister as if debating whether to approach. My pulse quickened. "You've been avoiding me," I said, immediately regretting the words. "I thought that's what you wanted," he replied, his voice even, unreadable. I swallowed hard. I don't know what's happening between us." He took a step forward, his expression calm but deliberate. "I think you do." I exhaled sharply, my hands tightening in my lap. "Harvey, this can't." "Why not?" he interrupted, voice quiet but firm, eyes locked on mine. "You keep pretending you don't feel it, but I see it." "I feel it." I opened my mouth to object, but the words wouldn't come, because he was right. I did feel it, and denying it only made it stronger. He took another step toward me, and I knew I should stand, create distance, and whatever was happening before it spiraled further out of control. But I didn't move. "You're scared," he said, his voice softer now. "Not because this is wrong, but because you don't know if you can stop yourself." My breath caught. "Harvey." Before I could finish, he was standing before me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. My pulse hammered in my chest. "I'm not going to do anything you don't want," he murmured, his gaze unwavering. "But you need to be honest with yourself." I closed my eyes, trying to push away the emotions swirling inside me. This wasn't just about temptation. It was about the undeniable connection that had been building between us, a connection I had tried so hard to ignore. When I opened my eyes, he was still watching me, waiting for my response, and I didn't know if I had the strength to give him the answer he deserved. The air between us remained thick with anticipation, neither of us speaking, neither daring to move. I could hear my own heartbeat, fast and insistent, thrumming against my ribs as if trying to warn me of what I already knew. I should have stepped back, should have told him to leave, to forget whatever had been developing between us. But instead, I remained still, my breath shallow, my hands pressing against my thighs in an attempt to ground myself. Harvey continued watching me, waiting for something, permission, encouragement, a sign that I wanted this as much as he did. And that was the problem. I did. But desire wasn't sufficient to make something right. I pushed myself to my feet, forcing a laugh that sounded more nervous than casual. "We're being ridiculous." His jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't move back. "You don't believe that." I swallowed hard. "Harvey, this isn't wrong," he cut me off. "Because it doesn't feel wrong." I inhaled sharply, the words catching in my throat. It wasn't about whether it felt wrong, it was about the consequences, the weight of choices that could never be undone. I shook my head. "It doesn't matter. We can't." He exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing, didn't move, just studied me with a patience that twisted my stomach into knots. Then, as if reaching some decision, he stepped back. "Fine." I blinked, the space between us suddenly too vast, too empty. "Fine." He nodded, his gaze unreadable. "If you really believe that we should ignore this, that it's nothing, then I'll drop it. I won't mention it again." Relief should have washed over me. I should have felt lighter, reassured that he was offering an exit, an escape from something I had no business entertaining. But all I felt was a hollow ache in my chest. I gave a slow nod, ignoring the disappointment curling in my stomach. "That's for the best." A flicker of something crossed his face, something I couldn't quite identify. "Right." He turned then, walking toward the stairs without another word. I didn't stop him, didn't call him back. I just stood there, watching him disappear, feeling the weight of something unfinished pressing down on me. The house felt different after that. The silence between us wasn't just thick, it was impenetrable. Harvey maintained his distance, not cold or cruel, but distant enough that I felt the absence of his presence in every room. I told myself this was what I wanted, that this was the right choice. But every time I caught him looking at me from across the house, that same unreadable expression in his eyes, I wondered if right was the same as bearable. The days that followed were quiet, too quiet. Harvey kept his word. He didn't bring it up again, didn't push, didn't cross any lines. But the air between us remained charged, heavy with everything unsaid. I should have felt relief, perhaps even gratitude that he had stepped back. But instead, I felt something entirely different, something that unsettled me far more than the guilt I had expected. I missed it. I missed the weight of his gaze, the way he challenged me, the way he forced me to acknowledge what was happening instead of evading it. Without his presence in my space, the house felt emptier, the hours stretched too long, and I found myself waiting for something I had already told myself could never happen. I threw myself into distractions, going out more often, running unnecessary errands, finding reasons to be anywhere but alone in the house with my thoughts. When home, I occupied myself with chores, preparing elaborate meals no one had requested, anything to keep my hands and mind engaged. But nothing helped, because no matter how much I tried to pretend otherwise, I knew the truth. I wanted him. And knowing that he had stopped pursuing, that he had decided to cease pushing, didn't make it easier. It made it worse. Because now I was the one contemplating what if. I was the one fighting the urge to cross the line I had so firmly drawn. Late one evening, after I had spent the day avoiding him as much as he had been avoiding me, I heard footsteps in the hallway. I was in the kitchen washing dishes, trying to focus on the rhythmic sound of water instead of the restlessness coiling inside me. When I turned, he was there, standing in the doorway. I froze, gripping the edge of the sink. Something wrong. My voice was steady, but my pulse was anything but. "No," he said, his expression unreadable. "Just thought maybe you were done avoiding me." I swallowed hard. "I'm not avoiding you." He arched an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced.
Right.
"That's why you've barely said a word to me in days." I turned back to the sink, focusing on scrubbing a plate that was already clean. "I just think it's for the best. Do you?" He stepped inside the kitchen, moving closer, not too close, but near enough that I felt the heat of his presence. "Because it sure doesn't look like you do." I turned off the faucet and exhaled slowly before facing him. Harvey, we agreed. No, he cut in smoothly. You agreed. I just didn't fight you on it. I pressed my lips together, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. Isn't that the same thing? Not even close. He studied me, his gaze slow and assessing. You want me to act like there's nothing here, but I know better. And so do you. A shiver ran down my spine, but I held firm. That doesn't mean we have to do anything about it. He took a step closer, near enough now that I could see the challenge in his eyes, the frustration just beneath the surface. Then why are you still standing here? I opened my mouth, but nothing emerged, because there was no answer that wouldn't unravel everything. He tilted his head slightly, waiting, giving me one final opportunity to push him away. But I didn't, and that was all the answer he needed. The moment stretched between us, neither moving, neither daring to breathe too deeply. I could feel the weight of his stare, the way it settled on me, daring me to break first. And perhaps I had been breaking for some time now, piece by piece, until nothing remained but the inevitable. I could have walked away, could have pushed him back, ended the moment before it had a chance to take root. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, my heart pounding, my breath shallow, waiting for him to say something, anything that would force me to make a decision I wasn't prepared to make. You don't want me to walk away, he finally said, his voice quiet but firm. I swallowed hard, my fingers curling around the edge of the counter. Harvey, this isn't. Don't say it's wrong, he interrupted. You don't believe that. I exhaled sharply, closing my eyes momentarily. It doesn't matter what I believe. It matters what's right. He stepped closer, the space between us diminishing to almost nothing. And this feels wrong to you? I didn't answer because we both knew the truth. It didn't. It felt inevitable, like something that had been approaching for a long time, no matter how much I had tried to deny it. Then stop pretending, he murmured. His words sent a shiver down my spine. I could feel my resolve weakening, slipping through my fingers like sand. The air around us crackled with something electric, something dangerous, and I knew in that moment that whatever line we had drawn before no longer existed. Tell me to leave, he said, his voice softer now, and I will. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to acknowledge what had been building between us. The tension, the stolen glances, the way my heart accelerated when he was near. It was all there, undeniable and impossible to ignore. But I couldn't say it. I couldn't tell him to leave, because I didn't want him to. And that was all the answer he needed. I knew I had crossed the line the moment I didn't tell him to leave. The tension between us wasn't just lingering, it was suffocating, all-consuming, engulfing us before either could stop it. My heart pounded as I felt his presence as close as it had ever been, yet still waiting, still giving me a chance to change my mind. But I wouldn't. I couldn't. Harvey's breath was steady, his hands at his sides, restrained. I could feel the heat radiating from him, my skin burning with the awareness that this was the moment where everything changed. I stepped back, just enough for space to exist between us, but not enough for the tension to dissolve. We can't come back from this, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't want to. His answer was immediate, certain, and the last thread of my resistance snapped. I had spent too long pretending, too long fighting against something that had already taken root. Every excuse, every logical reason why this shouldn't happen crumbled under the weight of the undeniable pull between us. I had convinced myself that avoiding him, ignoring the way he looked at me, would be enough to make it disappear. But I had been deceiving myself. Harvey closed the space between us, his fingers grazing my arm, his touch feather-light, waiting for me to push him away. But I didn't. Instead, I tilted my head, my eyes searching his, knowing that the moment I moved, the moment I surrendered, there was no turning back. And then I did. The world blurred, logic slipping through my fingers like water, and for the first time in months, I stopped thinking, stopped reasoning, stopped caring about consequences. Time moved differently after that. Moments blurred into days, and days blurred into something else entirely. I couldn't stop myself from wanting more, from finding excuses to be near him, to breathe the same air, to exist in the same space where this unspoken connection had been simmering for far too long. But reality has a way of intruding, no matter how much you try to shut it out. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, when the house was still and quiet. Marcus had returned the night before, unaware of the shift in the air, the secret that had taken root beneath his own roof. He kissed my cheek as he left for a round of golf, his touch familiar, his presence suddenly foreign. The guilt should have overwhelmed me. It should have shattered the fragile world I had constructed. But it didn't, and that terrified me more than anything else. Harvey was in the living room when I entered, his expression unreadable, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp. He had always been able to read me too well, and I knew without him having to say it that he sensed my internal struggle. "We can't keep doing this," I murmured, though the words felt hollow, weak. He studied me for a long moment before nodding, but there was no finality in his agreement. "I know." Silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of everything we couldn't express. I turned to leave, but his voice stopped me. "Do you regret it?" I should have said yes. I should have used that moment to end it, to erase what had happened before it could destroy everything. But when I turned to look at him, my answer was already written across my face. "No." He nodded once, his jaw tightening. "Neither do I." And with that, the truth settled between us, unshakable. I didn't regret it. Not then, perhaps not ever. But knowing that didn't make it any easier, because some choices don't come with clean resolutions. Some choices stay with you, haunting your every step, reminding you that once you've crossed a line, there's no going back, only forward into the unknown.